and welcome back to discussion number 7, where we're going to be reviewing Perrault versus Grimm fairy tales that we read for today. It might be helpful if you have out the Perrault versus Grimm note sheet that is attached at the bottom of this video. It is in no way required, but it may be helpful for you as we go through, as I expect you to know a lot of the stuff that's in this video, and it will probably appear on the midterm. So before we get into our discussion for the day, I want us to think about what constitutes a fairy tale. When you think about a fairy tale, what elements does it have to have for it to be considered a fairy tale? So the list that I have in front of you is a list that some students from a couple of years helped me create of what they thought constituted a fairy tale. So they pointed out that usually fairy tales needed some type of small magical aspect. So like within Cinderella, the fairy godmother who grants the wishes, that there's some type of happily ever after. Usually fairy tales don't have a bad ending. There's some type of, and they lived happily ever after. There's usually a moral or a lesson, and that there's a power dynamic, and that power dynamic is not usually an internal struggle, it's an external struggle so that we can physically see what it is that, that the good that's fighting against evil. And that usually there's some type of magical solution to that power struggle. Also, the characters are generally one-dimensional or flat, so there's only good or bad characters. They're not fleshed out enough for us to question where a character's allegiances lie. They're very clearly either good or bad. Another thing that they mentioned was that oftentimes characters in fairy tales go on some type of an adventure or a quest, and that they oftentimes wind up back home after that quest. They also talked about that there is usually an aspect of true love or romance, and that generally fairy tales are short and sweet. They're not long, drawn-out novels or stories. So you might think about a couple more aspects or themes that you would put on your list of what you think about when you're thinking of a fairy tale. But as we go throughout this discussion, but also our module in general, I want us to think about why is it that we have these ideas about fairy tales? Why is it that we identify that these specific things have to be in a fairy tale for us to consider it a fairy tale and of the fairy tale genre? Another thing that I want to bring up that I don't want to spend too much time on today, but something that we'll revisit later on, is that the rules within these fairy tales can be somewhat very much prescribed, as these are what girls do, these are what boys do. So oftentimes the rules for girls include a princess, and they're very concerned with fashion and being, up to date in their fashion. The girls can be mothers and raise children, or oftentimes we'll see that the female character becomes a witch or is the evil stepmother. And then the boys, often a prince and a king who has the power to rule, and they often can also be adventurers or fighters as well. So I want you to think about, as we go through today and talk a little bit more about these stories, as well as the rest of this module, think about how these gender roles or the roles that it tells these children that they would fit into can be limiting to children, and how that might be something that you think about if you decide to teach this or to share this with a young child. Is there a different way that you would go about teaching the story or talking about the story with somebody who may not have a clear idea that there are more things that they can be than just a mother or an adventurer? So I first want to talk about Charles Perrault, and he was a French intellectual and a member of the French Academy, and he started writing around 1697. Now, the stories that he was writing down were already well known throughout France. However, he adapted them in a way that fit better with the audience that he was trying to teach with his stories. So he directed these stories to adolescent girls who came to the French court, and oftentimes they were taken away at a very young age, and they oftentimes didn't get to see their family much after this, or even at all. And then they were trained to be good wives and good upper class royalty, and then they would be later married off, and oftentimes, and generally most of the time, they didn't have any choice in who they were being married off to. It was a arranged marriage. So his adaptations focused on the themes of romance and fashion because generally that was something that really entertained the girls that he was reading these stories to. And we'll see that throughout Sleeping Beauty that we talk about here in a bit as well. Another thing that he focuses on in his stories is the relationship between the husband and wife. And this is because these girls were taken away from their families at such a young age, and he didn't want them to be focusing on their families anymore. Instead, he wanted them to be thinking about their future husband and how they needed to be loyal and supportive of their future husband. Another aspect that he really focused on was a woman being virtuous and having really high moral standards and not in any way jeopardizing their virginity or their pureness before they were married to their arranged marriage husband. So now I want to talk about Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm. They were both German academics and brothers, as you may know, and they were both educated lawyers. They started writing their stories in the early 1800s, specifically 1812 was when their first edition of the Grimm fairy tales was published. And at this time, Germany was a very new country. So the purpose for writing then for the brothers Grimm was that they wanted their stories to be written in a way that could unite the German people. And it was targeted mainly towards German citizens that were usually in the middle to lower classes. So their adaptations focused on themes of the lower to middle class, lots of references to animals, nature, and wilderness. They also focused on the parent-child bond, so keeping the family together, and also obedience, so a child being obedient to their parent. So now I want to talk about and identify a few places within the Perrault and Grimm version of Sleeping Beauty that you read for today, where we can see places where Perrault and Grimm are appealing specifically to their audience and have a specific purpose for writing their text in the way that they do. So within the Perrault version of Sleeping Beauty in the Wood, we have this moment where the fairy or the fairies give the gifts of beauty, temper of an angel, wonderful grace, dance with perfection, sing like a nightingale, play every kind of music. So you can see that this relates back to what the expectations of were for these French girls that they're learning before they become wives. That these are some expectations that they should have for themselves to be good entertainers for the people that their husband may invite to court. A next point is that after Sleeping Beauty has fallen asleep, she's placed in the finest apartment in the palace upon a bed embroidered in gold and silver. And so this is a moment that harkens back to this idea that he was writing for an upper class audience, and girls specifically might be interested at this time in this kind of fashion and high class type stuff. Another really specific point and something that is totally different than in the Grimm version is that in Perrault's version, the king and queen leave rather than fall asleep at the court. Everybody else falls asleep, but the king and queen have to leave. So this goes back to that idea that these girls were taken away from their families and instead they needed to focus on the person that they were going to be eventually marrying. Another point is that there is no kiss between the prince and the princess. She just wakes up. And I think that this is a really important point because this is something that seems to be iconic to the moment where Sleeping Beauty is awoken, that there's this kiss. However, in the Perrault version, there's not because it's important for the female to stay virtuous, and that's not something that they would do if they weren't married yet. Another point is that there's this big long narration about how they go live with the prince's family afterwards, and the mother is an ogre. This again harkens back to this idea that the girls may not have a choice of the family that they're going to be married into, but they have to deal with those circumstances regardless. Then a couple moments from the Grimm version. So there's the frog out of the water that tells the queen that she'll be having a child. And then the wise women's gifts are a little bit different from what is expected of the fairies in the Perrault version. So they give lovely, that she's modest, that she's sweet, kind, and clever. So there's not so much emphasis on being this entertainer and a wife that can entertain this royalty that comes to her husband's court. Another point is the king and queen fell fast asleep with the whole court, so they stay there. So again, there's that idea that there's this focus on the family bond. And then there's a lot of references to animals, to nature, so the horses in their stalls, the dogs in the yard, pigeons, etc., all fall asleep. So whereas in the Perrault version they don't really touch on, the animals and that kind of stuff, in the Grimm version they do.